Hey Nathan, how you doing? You okay?
Yeah, hanging in there. Beautiful Southern California day. It's about 75 degrees outside.
Yeah, lovely. I do miss that sun from when I lived out in LA for those 2 years. The weather is fantastic in California.
It's addicting. It makes it really hard to leave, as crazy as everything else is in this state.
It is, yeah, and the quality of life's insane as well. But cool. Obviously, I've been a couple of weeks since we've caught up. Have you been up to much? How's things moving in within the business?
We're charging ahead. We've had about three exercises in the last month that we're participating in with our various products across the services, and getting ready to do some big product rollouts in the next couple of weeks, and announce some contract awards. So things are going pretty well overall. Up to about 36 people now. I expect to be to about 40 by the end of the year, and we've made some really top shelf hires, particularly as of late on the business development team. Just a lot of people coming out of SOCOM with very deep electronic warfare experience, as well as some just top tier software and hardware engineers.
Nice, good. Well, obviously, really excited for the business, and we'll break all that down today. But I suppose just before we jump into the actual podcast, if you want to do a brief introduction to yourself, just so ultimately our listeners know who they're listening to today from our guests.
Yeah, I'm Nathan Mintz. I'm a career aerospace and defense engineer slash entrepreneur. I spent 14 years at Boeing and Raytheon prior to founding Epirus, which is a defense unicorn that works on high power microwave systems for drones and other electronics. I basically take them out with EMP. And then I was founding CEO of that, ran that for a couple of years, and then I had a company called Spartan Radar that did automotive radar for autonomous vehicles and automated driving systems. And we sold that one last year to John Deere. And then I've been working on CX2 here, which is a next generation electronic warfare company for going on about a year and a half now, although we started kind of brainstorming the idea about 2 years ago. So happy to be here. We've raised $46 million to date from Andreessen Horowitz, 8VC, Point 72, and our products are starting to enter the market and entering user evaluation. We actually have some pilot products in the hands of some customers that are evaluating them right now and getting ready for sort of more rigorous evaluation in a real-time war environment overseas at some point soon. And I'm here calling in from beautiful El Segundo, California, where the kind of the epicenter of the hardware slash hard tech, deep tech boom is. We probably have something like 100 deep tech or hard tech startups here in El Segundo or the adjacent areas. It's sort of become the new Palo Alto.
Definitely.
Atoms, not bits. So that's where we're at.
Good. And obviously, fantastic you're on your third business. Obviously, the entrepreneurial American mindset, great to see different industries. So, really excited to hear your journey. But I guess, obviously, quick one, we always like to jump in before we go into the actual podcast. Like, when you're not working, which I imagine is not very often, like, what you're doing for fun, what you're doing away from work to keep yourself entertained.
Well, I mean, I have four kids and they keep me entertained: 13, 11, 9, and 5. And my beautiful wife, who is, you know, always somewhere with them, and I try and help out where I can. This Friday will be Halloween, so we'll be out trick or treating with the kids.
Nowhere better than America for Halloween. That was one of the things
Yeah.
I loved in LA. The Halloween was
Um,
fantastic.
I've organized the ushers for high holidays at our synagogue this year. I have a few side projects. I'm also an advisor to a couple other startups in the space. Center Systems, Dynamics, Sapphire. Um, Sapphire Group, Hexium, etc. I have a number of other deep tech startups that I sort of keep in touch with and keep an eye on, and try and help out and cultivate. And Viridian Systems.
Very busy, which is great. Okay, good. And family's fantastic, but cool. Okay, we'll go into the initial section of the actual podcast then, I suppose. It's the journey to becoming an entrepreneur. So if you were to look back at like your childhood, is there any early influences across that or your education or personal background that hinted at this entrepreneurial mindset that you clearly have?
Well, my father's a commercial fisherman, so he was always self-employed. So I worked for his growing up. So obviously, you know, when your mental model is somebody who has a hard time working for other people, and then you get thrust into a Dilbert company and have to work for other people, that's somewhat of a mismatch. But I've always been interested in solving problems and what we can do with science and engineering to kind of advance humankind. And my grandfather had been a radar receiver engineer for Hughes, along with his brother, Hughes Aircraft. And so I was always fascinated by defense and aerospace systems and stuff. So when I went to college, I got 2 degrees in material science engineering. And at the time, semiconductor was in the absolute toilet. So internships and other things like that were kind of scarce unless I wanted to move to Korea or something. And grad school just seemed like, living on peanuts. So one summer I was working as a front desk clerk in Pebble Beach, of all places. I grew up in Monterey. And I had a guy come up to the desk and say, "Hey, I asked for a room move." And I pull down the note and say, "Yeah, let me see what I can do here." And I wanted ocean view. He was facing the parking lot. I said, "Hey, you work for Raytheon?" "Yeah, I kind of run the company, or rather it runs me." And I'm talking to him, and I think I'm talking to some middle manager or whatever. And I said, "Yeah, I talked to like your guys at the career fair at Stanford and stuff, and they didn't seem to get it. They were just kind of collecting resumes." He said, "Yeah, that kind of happens sometimes." I said, "Well, the concierge will be up there in 15, 20 minutes to move you, sir. Why don't you go up, get packed, and we'll get going from there." And he puts his business card kind of upside down and slides it to me across the desk and says, "Hey, why don't you send your resume my way and see what I can do?" And or see what you can
Fantastic.
do. And I thought I was talking to, like I said, like a director or vice president or something. I was actually talking to Bill Swanson, who's the incoming
Wow.
CEO, or was the incoming CEO at the time at Raytheon, and he was probably one of the longest term CEOs of Raytheon before it was bought by or merged with United Technologies and turned into RTX. So that was my first job. He kind of set it up. I get a call from some guy named John Malinowski in HR about 2 days later and said, "Hey, Bill sent your resume. You're actually pretty top tier for the college talent we have. I'm surprised that you didn't make it through the filter." I ended up having my first job at Raytheon in El Segundo. I was there for about 9 years. Wrote about 6 patents, worked on a whole bunch of radar programs and stuff. I used to fly around in a test plane, and we used to do radar operations and take measurements and test out new modes and algorithms and stuff. And then after that, I left that for 5 years, went over to Boeing, worked weapons, worked satellites, worked on the X-37 program, a bunch of other stuff like that, and ended up in business development. And then I had a couple bad days in a row, and I had known my friend Joe Lonsdale for a long time. We went to school together. We both wrote for the Stanford Review. I think he was editor of the Stanford Review. And he was at my wedding. I went to one of his. He had like 3 different parties. He's a lot of people.
Big wedding.
Yeah, he had a big wedding. It was at Legion of Honor in San Francisco. It's beautiful.
Nice.
And so he called. I call him up. I'm like, "Hey Joe, could I just go work in VC or tech or something? Like this is starting to like really suck here." He goes, "Well, you could. I could make you an associate or whatever, and that'd be really good. But the best VCs and stuff start their own companies. So we're thinking
Nice.
about like a defense vertical, and if there's any ideas that you might have." And I had been involved with him about 15 years before. We started something called California Common Sense that was a nonprofit to basically use Palantir to crack the California state budget and show with transparency where all the money was going and the dysfunction, how it was being wasted, and select solutions. And so that turned into a company called OpenGov that I was an advisor to early on. So we kind of knew I had like some knack for fixing things. I'd ran for assembly, and that's kind of an entrepreneurial thing. You start a campaign from scratch, got to raise money, got to build a team, etc. Did that like back in 2010, 2012. And so he's like, "Why don't you start a company?" I'm like, "Well, what do you mean?" He's like, "Well, just go come up with an idea and come back to me and we'll jam on it." I'm like, "Okay." So, he calls me a few weeks later and says, "Hey, I've got this partner who wants to start a defense vertical named John.
Love
Do you
it.
have any ideas?" And like, as I'm talking to him on the phone, an airport in Gatwick in England is being shut down by drones. And I'm like, "Well, what's
Yeah.
going on here?" So I go look up. There was a report from Bard College of all places that had shown that there were 200 counter UAS solutions that were out there, and 90% of them were some crappy jammer somebody built in their garage for
Yeah.
$40,000, and they pretty much all sucked. Nothing worked. And so one solution that seemed to make sense to me that did work was this electromagnetic pulse system that Raytheon had built, but it was $25 million, and it was the size of a house, and it was like, this isn't really practical. It used a Klystron they pulled out of a particle accelerator and just all this crazy stuff. So, I sat down and thought about it and said, "Well, I bet you could do this with gallium nitride and solid state phase arrays. The power levels are about right." And I I was dropping my kids off at preschool and I ran into Bo Mar, who's, I'd known for a long time. And I said, hey, Bo, um, I had this kind of crazy idea. And he said, I actually have like been down to their facility and I kind of thought the same thing, which is why are they still using analog power sources for this stupid?
Yeah.
So I said, well, how would we go about proving it? So we went out to Walmart, bought some drones, bought a voltage source, like wired it up and figured out when it smoked. And then based on those measurements, we were able to kind of back out to, you would need a system like this. And we came up with a design that closed. And so we threw it all on a pitch deck. I fly up to San Francisco Joe had this temporary office in North Beach at the time, which is like where they filmed Dirty Harry and stuff. And I give the pitch, and the original name for Epirus was actually called Wave Strike. Because two of the guys were surfers, and it was like wave striking, electromagnetic wave striking a target to defeat it. And then I'm like, no, but Joe's really into like mythology and stuff. Let me think of a name. And so I remember there was something called the bow of Theseus, or the Epirus bow from mythology, and I think it's actually apocrypha. I think it was like from one of the movies or something. But the bow of Theseus was an actual thing, not the Epirus bow. And so I said, well, why don't we just call it Epirus? So
nice.
5 minutes before the meeting, and I go in there and I'm pitching to Joe what we're going to do, and he says, well, this sounds really cool. You're basically building a giant ray gun to zap drones electromagnetically. What happens when they get smart and they wrap it in tinfoil? And I go, well, that's the beauty of it. Then they got to pay us to build a bigger gun.
Yeah. Okay.
And he gets all excited and says, hey, starts rattling off at about 300 words a minute. And I'm like, what's going on? And then finally, the dust settled. And I said, hey, Joe, you want to bring me up to speed with everything you just told your staff? He says, well, we're going to give you $3 million. You're going to be CEO. Your other buddies are going to leave Raytheon. And then you're going to, start this company. What did you say it was called again? Oh, yeah, Epirus. What?
Cracking name.
It was like, you ever see that scene in Wayne's World when he's like, "It's me, baking powder. You're going to pay us to do Wayne's World." That's what it kind of felt like.
Yeah. What a great film that is.
Yeah. And so I call up, he's like, go call Judy, go call your wife and tell her that you're going to quit your job and you're going to start this company. I'm like, okay. So I was actually fairly good at it. And so I just kind of kept doing it. So, I was CEO of Epirus for about 2 years. Took it from kind of start to about, the beginning, halfway between the A and the B. And then I started Spartan after that, ran that for about 3.5 years, and then got into this. So yeah, it's been a fun journey.
Definitely, yeah. It's really interesting. It seems like you had the thing, but you had some mentors or people that were, but even though you always don't do it, that kind of push you down that path a little bit quicker, which is great to see. Sometimes those people that or potential mentors that can direct you quicker, that's the first time I've heard of that. But obviously, great, and the success you've had in the other two is great. And then with CX2, so obviously covered a lot of the questions there in that overview there, so I won't get you to repeat yourself, but focus in regards to CX2, obviously how did you go from first steps on concept to action? Obviously I know you already had the idea, but how did you go from there to actually setting the company up, and any interesting stories around that?
My co-founder Porter had made several trips to Ukraine, and he got in touch with me, and he had gone out there and he'd actually gone to the front lines and seen how they were using jammers and how they were using RF sensing equipment and stuff. And, he'd been an Army helicopter pilot. He'd flown for SOCOM, and he flew Apaches in Afghanistan and stuff. And so he had some familiarity with EW systems and how they work. Dawned on him, my God, this is just totally different from how the U.S. EW enterprise is currently set up. Because U.S. and NATO, as an extension of that, is really focused around a few large, exquisite systems to do missions from a very large standoff range. What you're seeing in Ukraine is sort of cheap systems that are, very, very many in number, proliferated, attritable mass, right? And it's a response to the fact that, we've kind of replaced expensive missiles with cheap drones, in just thousands of them, right?
And they cause a lot of damage to the expensive piece of equipment, which is the regular.
Yeah, and they're automated. It's automation in extremis, right? So you've got all these jammers, you've got GPS jammers, you've got counter UAS jammers, you've got lots of data links, and it's just ubiquitous. And the way that we do systems would be totally overwhelmed. We built stuff either for one of two purposes. Either it was to in the global war on terror to stop IEDs from being triggered, So just
Hmm.
sort of noise jammers that go on like vehicles and stuff, or it was large exquisite platforms like Compass Call and Rivet Joint and Growler that are designed to detect radars from hundreds of miles away and really kind of home in on those and to defeat those radars, right? What's called suppression of enemy air defenses. Or we have a lot of systems built for self-protect, like all the aircraft have jammers on them, so if a missile's launched they can sort of defend themselves, right? But um, the difference is that if you look at it in Ukraine, it's become a standard part of every soldier's kit, and it's become ubiquitous, and it's a part of the whole domain of warfare to the point where it's almost like these counter UAS jammers are almost the spectrum equivalent of barbed wire and and landmines
Yeah.
almost in the spectrum. And there are obstacles that have to be cleared, right? So Porter had this
Yeah.
insight, and he came to me and said, "I think that there's room here to build a next generation EW Prime." And I said, well, that's very interesting. So I go do some research, and I'd been talking to a new friend, Mark Trefgarn at the time, who was introduced to us, mutually introduced, who'd sold a software company to Facebook. And the thought was that if you could take this idea of attritable mass, of ubiquitous sensing systems, seeking systems, and marry them to build an offensive electronic wall that can find, fix, and finish all the emitters on the battlefield, and then loop it all together with enterprise software, which is sort of Mark's forte, to provide effectively make the invisible battlefield visible and allow you to operate that in that as an independent domain of warfare, then you would have something special. And so we brought it together. We brought in another co-founder, Lee Thompson, who was in charge of building the whole RF stack for Starship at SpaceX. So
Yeah,
really
of
good.
course. RF is one of the most difficult pain points around the world as well. So it's good to have a founder strong with that.
Well, I mean, and obviously I had some background in it, but I'm not exactly going to roll up my sleeves and go into the lab nowadays.
Hmm.
Past those days. And so we put the team together and formed CX2 and said, hey, we're going to go build these electronic warfare systems that can build that offensive electronic wall that can basically be the vanguard in the fifth domain of warfare. So you have land, air, sea, air, and space, and then it's all connected through the spectrum. The data links connect all of them. We're using the spectrum for sensing and sense making as well as for communication, and everything's wireless now. I mean, by definition, there's no wires in space, right?
Of
Or
course,
in
yeah.
the air, for that matter. I mean, there's some like controversy with tethered drones, but we're not going to tether an F-15, right? So everything is done wirelessly, and so mastery, having dominance of that domain, is essential. And what we found in Ukraine is that there's a gap in our current capabilities to having dominance in that domain, or even superiority in some extent. We were sending a lot of Western kit over there, HIMARS missiles,
Hmm.
etc., and they were being defeated by cheap Russian GPS jammers, right? Because we didn't have dominance of the spectrum, right? So we're building the systems to allow us to establish that dominance and survive, not just survive, but thrive.
Yeah. Nice. Obviously, good innovations there and good products and good market speed, which is fantastic. Okay. And obviously, companies, obviously, to you on a really good upward trajectory and style path. I suppose, briefly, just for our listeners, because obviously, it's glamour, you've done very well with the three businesses, but it's not always just rainbows, is it? There is challenges along the way. So, if you were to look back to maybe before you set up your first business, was there any personal sacrifices? Was there anything that you had to give up or change in those early journeys of any of the startups at all? Just so we know that our potential future founders, it's not a straightforward path.
Well, I mean, I definitely took a pay cut at first,
Yeah, it's a
but
common.
I have one friend of mine who's just a lifetime entrepreneur. He's been building companies since he was like 20, and he jokes that entrepreneurs live paycheck to paycheck. The difference is that the paychecks are obviously much larger.
Yeah,
So
if the company goes well.
yeah, and that's an adjustment not just for you but for your family. And I think the hours, the fact that like with even if you have a challenging job, um, for the most part, you know, it's not the same as when you're the boss and like it's all on you. Like you're constantly thinking about it. It's very hard to unplug on weekends. I mean, I turn my phone off one day a year, right? Like on Yom Kippur, that's it. The rest of the time, I'm, pretty much always on, and
Yeah,
it can be a bit distracting to always have it in your headspace, right, and always be
yeah,
grinding at it. Some people are
yeah,
wired that way. I mean, I think that like there's a certain type of personality that has to always be working on a problem.
Yeah, of course.
And I certainly fit into that, but
You
yeah.
almost don't enjoy work-life balance or enjoy switching off to some extent. Always looking for that new thing, that new challenge, that new way to improve. Always reviewing and being quite critical of themselves is what I see, which is good. And it's like constantly searching challenges in spaces, which is great. Okay, and then obviously from when you initially went to set up the business or any of these early stage startups, is there any lessons from failure or any early mistakes that if you wish you knew at that time that you think would be invaluable to someone that's going on this journey to set up their first business that you think would be great
So
advice?
there's a number of incubators where I give a talk called 10 Things I Learned the Hard Way.
Okay, fantastic. We'll put a
And,
link to that.
I talk about these things, and like kind of the first one is that, like, market forces oftentimes dominate your competence. So like
Hmm.
you'd rather be incompetent in a really hot market than competent in a in a really bad market,
A
because
fantastic
for one
lesson.
thing, you're not going to be able to raise very much money. And frankly, if you take the bootstrapped route and decide I'm just going to build out a small business that I can kind of like comfortably scale for myself, it's a different story than if you're taking venture capital. Because if you're taking venture capital, you have to bring in another partner who, their time horizon, they really want to see results. I mean, as much as we talk about patient capital and everything, they really want to see some proof of traction within a couple of years, and ideally within 5, it's really sort of taking off. And then the idea is that the company really needs to be set up to exit within 9 to 11 years, right? As opposed to, like, if you're building a restaurant chain or whatever, you can make that work for your lifetime, right? I mean, I know a lot of family owned businesses that are 30, 40 years in, right? And it's still the same owner, same proprietor. So if you take a bootstrapped approach, it's harder because like every decision is like one of survival. But if you take a venture backed approach, you really have to set up to go aggressively, right? And you have to pay attention to, am I investing in something that other VCs want to invest in? I got one person who was foolish enough to write me a check, or maybe more than one, and get a round started. But if I'm thinking that I'm going to scale this to a venture scale business, meaning something that could go public, that could turn into a market cap of 25 or 50 or $100 billion or more, which is really what the investors are searching for and are getting excited about. Um, that sort of power law return. I really think that you got you got to really think about that. So like choose your market, choose your moment to enter, right? Because like timing, like Spartan, we had a great idea, we had a great product, but we were too late to the party. And so by the time we kind of got traction and figured out the customers and kind of had product market fit, the whole autonomous vehicle market was kind of blowing up.
Yeah, fair. And you're a bit better. You were slightly behind the curve, so you were
Yeah,
chasing already.
well, the Gardner curve, we talk about the trough of disillusionment, like the whole industry was just, burying the bow, so to speak, into that trough of disillusionment. So that's sort of like lesson one, would be like, make sure that if you're in a hot market, raise often, raise when you don't need to, make sure you have enough to what you need if you go the venture route, right? And then sort of like the next one is, just be very careful about who you take money from and like who you put on your board and stuff, because it's like a marriage you can't undo. Like once you have investors on the cap table, I mean, sometimes it's easy, you can get them bought out, but once they're on your board and stuff, it's like a Catholic marriage, pre Henry VIII. Like you can't undo it. Yeah. And then like some other lessons, just like I think that people tend to, first time founders worry a lot about like their idea and like protecting their idea, and oh, I have an advantage here. And so I think really emphasizing like, how do I build a system that can scale? How do I take this idea and figure out, you're going to have many ideas, and sometimes your first idea isn't what gets product market fit, it's many others. So building that flywheel that can test those hypotheses, and then if they don't pan out, quickly throw them away, and if they do build out, quickly scale them. I think it's the key to success, is sort of agility and in that entrepreneurial OODA loop, if you will.
So almost like creating a hardware loop on the visions and the ideas of constantly looking back and going, okay, what's right, what's wrong here? When you get the right thing, being able to scale it quickly. I love that advice, and that being able to flexible and agile around it.
That's a big part of it, is just understanding that execution matters more than ideas, and it's about there's kind of three things that you're building at the same time if you're building a venture scale company. you're building, and this is not a Nathan idea. This is coming from Christopher Lochhead, Think Bigger,
Hmm.
or the godfather of category design, is that you're doing enterprise engineering, product engineering, and category engineering all at the same time. You
Okay.
have to define the battlefield or of the marketplace in which you play. How does your particular product and company play within the overall market, and defining the category in which you exist? The
Hmm.
enterprise, building the scaffolding of the company, building a company that can actually work without you having to sit there and press every lever all the time. And a lot of entrepreneurs get themselves in trouble on that. Like,
Yeah.
I was sitting in on one of these. There's like these therapy sessions, or like AA for CEOs, and
Right.
everybody throws in a problem that's like really hairy and how to process it. And there was a couple of people who had problems along the lines of, my company's been going for 10 years. I'm the only person with all the root key passwords, and I have God administration privilege. I have no one else to go to. What happens if something happens to me? And I'm like, don't do that. Like,
Just roll it out to people. Yeah.
and like it was just like a foreign concept to them, that you need to trust in other people. No man is an island, and if you can't trust them, get rid of them, right? But like, you need to be able to trust other people. Like, there's lots of things around here that honestly, it's better if I don't have the keys to everything,
Of
because
course.
what happens if my account gets hacked, right? And so having redundancies and checks and balances on certain things, large wires out of the account, etc., are actually a good thing, right? So like,
Love
yeah,
it.
I think that's another key piece of it, is just surrounding yourself, building a network of people that you can trust, and that takes time. And
And
I
experience
was
as well, I imagine.
I was very fortunate to kind of find those people right away, and I think part of it's kind of like your attitude, is that
Yeah.
like, if you exude mistrust and sort of skepticism into the universe, then like people are going to kind of feel it back. I mean, I'm not saying don't be a hack, but I think like, or don't let people take advantage of you. Don't be gullible. But there's sort of a balance between that and being paranoid, right? And so like, you have to kind of like find that and get a good, you know, kind of feel for if you can trust people or not. Not everyone has that. Like,
Which is a difference maybe between success or different problems. Okay, cool. Great overview there. Great, fantastic learning, multiple good insights, which is great. What is the vision of CX2? Now, what is the vision of the company?
yeah, so we've kind of built everything. We have a thesis called the Spectrum Imperative, which there's a website online you can go to called thespectrumimperative.com. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create the system of systems and the products that allow the U.S. to establish spectrum superiority in that fifth domain of warfare. So basically building the not just the defensive systems, but the offensive electronic wall that allows us to conquer and occupy the spectrum as sovereign territory. And that means that we're talking about proliferated, autonomous, attritable at scale electronic warfare systems for both sensing, seeking, attack, all of that, right? So the vision is to build those out so that we no longer need to have large, exquisite systems that are few in number, but we've replaced it with sort of swarms of drones acting as nodes in the interweaved space between the spectrum and the other domains of warfare, right? Because the spectrum, it manifests itself only within physical reality, right? Like
Of
an
course.
emitter has to be, it's not like cyberspace where something's sort of sitting out there and it has a virtual address and a pointer. Right? There's a physical location that something is transmitting and receiving from, so you have
Of
to have
course.
that physical presence to actually own the territory, even if the territory sort of exists ethereally. So we're trying to build those systems that can conquer and hold that spectral territory and give the U.S. an advantage, or U.S. and our allies an unfair advantage in future conflict.
Nice. And obviously, which is a large product to develop and design, but a fantastic solution with great market potential, which I'll watch from afar. But I guess if you're to look at CX2 for the next 5 to 10 years, from your standpoint as a founder, what would you class as success looking like in that period of time?
Multiple systems being fielded and in use, and being able to establish a presence in all four physical domains to
Hmm.
help establish spectral superiority. We're looking at putting systems on unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned outposts, called landers or signal towers. We're looking at drones, obviously, at unmanned surface vessels, underwater domain, and then up in space, right? And having sensors in all of those with an enterprise software layer that's able to tie it all together and provide a common operational picture for the user, and then allow them to manipulate those things at scale automatically. So one of the revolutions that's going on right now, and you crane everything, if I was to kind of break down autonomy into three layers, and this is kind of how the labs are thinking about it now, you have automation, auto mix, and then autonomy, right? So automation is like FPV drones, right? Where there's still a pilot. I mean, he's flying it, but it's remotely operated. Autonomix means there's some higher degree of intelligence, like maybe they've added waypoints or automated target recognition, right? And then autonomy, like full-blown autonomous systems, means that you're able to give these systems high-level orders and instructions, and they're able to self-organize and execute those missions and provide and ask for human input. It's almost human on the loop, only in
Just
in
verifying
very
and testing
limited
it.
situations. Verify, yes, this is what you want me to do, or hey, boss, this course of action you told me to take doesn't make sense anymore. Can I reiterate, right? So I think moving from today, where we're still largely in the automation domain, there's a little bit down into the autonomics domain, and going into full autonomy, where you have hundreds of drones that you're able to command, kind of like you ever play Command and Conquer as a kid.
Yeah, what a great game. And I was actually just cracking that joke the other day that literally it feels like that's what warfare is becoming.
Yeah, so being able to grab hundreds of systems and say, here, go, go attack the Zorks or whatever they were called, and have them kind of self-organize and coordinate amongst themselves. So it takes the cognitive load off the user, because right now we're pretty much in a 1v1 environment, right? And so we need to scale from 1v1 to 1v many, both on an offensive and a defensive side. And so we want to facilitate that. And we think that the way that you do that is by building systems that can take and hold and act offensively in that spectral domain on these autonomous platforms at scale.
And then also, it's not you just obviously said it's bringing the whole ecosystem together from land to sea to air to space, and have it where you can almost have all these different capabilities across it communicating into one system. So certainly like Command and Conquer, but in the real world, which is a good analogy there. Fantastic. Okay, which is good. Moving on to yourself a little bit then, because it's a good overview of the company, and CX2 is I suppose defining the why. Like obviously for you, obviously not with this, but there must be something within you or something within your blood, like you're on your third or fourth startup already. Like what's the personal mission and why this and why now?
I like building stuff.
Yeah.
And I like building companies that solve hard problems. I have a particular interest in RF systems. I've been fascinating with them my whole career, and sensor systems. And I'm very fortunate to have been born at the time that I was born, where, the only limitation, it feels like, to technology these days is our imagination. I mean, particularly with the rise of generative AI and things like that. And I'm just enough of an extrovert where I can actually network and find the right people. And to some extent, building the company and finding, like, there's a guy named Jim Collins who wrote a book called Good to Great, and one of his lessons was, when we talked about like the key things of like building a great company, one of them is getting the right people on the bus and finding everyone a seat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finding the right seat. So I think like that's one of the things that I've kind of developed a knack for, is like getting the right people on the bus and really creating a culture of A players that are virtuous on each other. And I've had a number of people point this out to me, and I didn't really notice it at first, but I try and treat other people the way that I would want to be treated. Like I set high expectations, and if you're not cutting it, then we need to find you a new role outside of the company, or maybe a new role inside the company. If you're just if it's the one you're in isn't suited for you, you have to provide respect. You can't work them into the ground. I think we work hard around here. I mean, you come in, you'll see people here at 8 o'clock at night a lot of the time.
Of course, like you have to be, but it's by
But
choice rather than by force.
Or later, there's a couple times when guys solve something in the lab here and then celebrated by going to the Purple Orchid down the street and getting a Mai Tai, just before closing. How late is that, right? I think like being generous and virtuous with people, and like having some empathy, is something that's unfortunately too rare in the corporate world, and I think that if you do that, people see that, and then that instills loyalty, and makes them want to bring other people who, good people into the mix. And so, like, having a corporate culture that supports people. We've had a couple of women come through who, have gone through pregnancies, and we've always supported
Of
them,
course.
and made sure that they had all the resources they need and ample maternity leave. And we've had, men here who have had children as well, that we've made sure that they have, all the resources they need for paternity leave, and that we're, making sure they have time for their family, because it turns out that, like, in addition to being like a good person and a good human being, like, there's actually an economic case to not burning people out and churning them out as well.
Course, and obviously I did see the world is moving towards that definitely a lot more than it once was, but there is still that feel of corporate delivery results now, presence that's kicking. There's many examples of companies that have had some form of success like that, but it's good to hear that you're more the other way, where yeah, you're very ambitious, very driven with high standards, but you're also got the caring side, and that's the way you want to build the business long term, which is a good thing in high pressure environment to stick to. And then from your thing, like, why have you always been in and around the defence industry as an entrepreneur? What's attracted you there?
I mean, I've always had an interest in defense and military history and stuff, but I mean,
Hmm.
I did take a couple years out, and we started. I still have the data sheet for it. We started Spartan in 2021,
As
and
you
that
said,
was
yeah,
automotive radar.
yep,
So that was my one foray into, civilian engineering, if you will, sort of dual use technology. But I think, like, some of the hardest problems are in aerospace and defense.
definitely,
Putting a person on Mars is really hard.
yeah,
It's like a history defining thing. Breaking the sound barrier, shooting down ballistic missiles. These are really hard problems. The spectrum. Like, these are really hard problems, and I found it intellectually rigorous and exciting. And there's, a political aspect to it, and kind of a whole society aspect to it. I mean, Clausewitz said that war is just the extension of politics by other means. And I think that, like, understanding how all the different pieces play together. Um, Building a defense company nowadays is kind of like building a three-ring circus, in the sense that there are three different constituencies. The warfighter, who actually has to derive value from what your product does, obviously, and it has to help them. There's the Pentagon and the program execution offices that need to know how to acquire it, sustain it, evolve it, pay for it. And then lastly, there's the appropriators and the authorizers in Congress and the White House and stuff, who have to actually think that it's useful and in the national interest. And so you got to kind of be a ringleader of that three ring circus at all times to have a successful defense company in this day
yeah,
and age. And I think that was kind of the thing that kind of screwed up the first couple generations of defense entrepreneurship, is that they may have ignored the sort of WASTA component, if you will, of, like, we need legislative support, or maybe they had that, but they didn't quite have the ins with the PEOs and the actual, like, acquisition customer framework that they needed, or maybe they just had this piece and they didn't talk to the warfighter, right? So one of the key things that sort of defined second generation or third generation defense companies versus the other two was that we now know we have to have all three of those aligned. And on top of that, the customer has kind of grown new receptors on the enzyme to
okay,
catalyze these, like DIU and other things, so that we now know where to lock on. You have this whole, I mean, some people call it innovation theater, but it's offices like DIU and others. They're designed to go out and look for new ideas, and it's not just DARPA, which, I mean, DARPA does a lot of good things, but
yeah,
nowadays it's mostly been captured by the primes. About 70 to 80% of DARPA's budget goes to, like, the same 8 contractors,
yeah,
right? And so it's kind of hard to believe that all the innovation, 70 to 80% of the innovation in the country, is coming out of those
eight
7 or 8
companies.
contractors. So I think, like, the understanding the three ring circus and how that plays has been something that we figured out and cracked in the last few years. And up until recently, it was something that really only the executive tribal knowledge within the primes had really dialed in. So, stay tuned.
Of course, and the innovation there, and the industry is changing rapidly, and I do agree. Like across obviously where you are, but not just that whole of America, there seems to be really exciting technology startups within the defence industry as we move things forward. It's a very exciting time, and I always just think, obviously, you said the biggest challenge is there. I always think actually a lot of the technical innovation comes from that industry anyway, and then it goes into the more commercial world, doesn't it? Where those things are innovated first. So if you're looking to be at the forefront of technology, like you are, and these ideas, the idea or the concepts of the initial research will typically, most of the time, from my opinion, come from the defense industry.
I would say it's flipped. I would say that
Okay.
that if you look at like the amount of commercial semiconductor volume or commercial electronics volume or automotive or whatever, it dwarfs defense. And
Wow.
so,
Okay.
yeah, so our whole supply chain and everything is actually dependent upon commercial, which is partly why we're the pickle we're in with the Chinese, is that we went to a global, Tom Friedman world is flat just in time supply chain. And all the MBA sat there and worried about, margins and just on time and efficiency rather than robustness. And so the result of that is that the Chinese, with heavily subsidized, state controlled industries, were able to capture critical parts of the supply chain that we're just now starting to unwind. Even big companies like Apple are trying to unwind it. I mean, if you go read Apple in China,
Well, rare
um,
metals, key
you
thing
know,
right now, isn't it?
talks about this a lot, that Apple probably spent $150 billion, the equivalent of the Marshall Plan, teaching China how to make iPhones and iPads and iMacs and all that other iBooks and all that other stuff. And then they realized that they had been captured by the Chinese and their supply chains, and they've spent a large part of the last decade trying to
Oof.
unwind that as a result. Like COVID was a wake up call, and then these tariffs and sanctions are a wake up call. To some extent, the tariffs are kind of acting as chemotherapy to uncouple the world industries from somewhat predatory practices within
Wow.
the PRC, right? It's harsh medicine, but it's necessary. I mean, like you think about it, rare earths is a big one that we're
Yeah.
talking about right now. It came up with Trump and Sane at the was it Sane Takeichi? That's the new Japanese prime minister. It came up like at the summit, which is like, how do we get it where 95% of our rare earths, 99% of certain types of magnets are only made in China right now. We've actually lost the know-how for how to make a lot of these things, for how to do things like wind motors. And it's because we got so focused on margins that we forgot about second sources. And it's not just an issue for defense, it's an issue for all of our industries, right? And then the fact that TSMC, certain generations of chips like the 2 nanometer gate, et cetera, are entirely dependent upon Taiwan, which is 40 nautical miles from the PRC, and could be invaded at any time, or certainly blockaded, and then the entire global supply chain shuts down. So to some extent, COVID was a wake up call, because you couldn't get stuff into the ports. Like, how do I keep building
Hmm.
a global supply chain if the 30% of the manufacturing is completely turned off, right, or shut off, like what we saw in 2020, 2021? But now it's like, well, there's certain areas where entire industries, because of the Chinese trade practices, have been captured. And like, with like the rare earths, we mine praseodymium and all these other things here in the United States. They mine them in Australia, they mine them in Chile. Like, the
Yeah.
rocks in China are not unique, but the sintering processes and stuff that they use to leach it out of the ore, to sinter the magnets, etc. Western environmental laws have deemed them too toxic, and so those industries all moved to China, where they were heavily subsidized and we were asleep at the switch. And
Yeah.
so now we're sort of forcing these things and uncoupling, and you're seeing investment in those industries, and people are willing to say, you know what? I'm willing to pay $4 a magnet rather than $3 a magnet, if
To
it
have it
means
here,
that I'm not completely dependent upon this one source that can screw me later, right?
we're not allowing a
And
monopoly. We're trying to
yeah,
fight a
so like
monopoly.
what we saw is that over time it used to be there was an entirely defense only supply chain, and some things there still is. Like, you go look at a safe arming device and a fuse, for example, or solid rocket motors or something like that. We still have largely a defense only supply chain. In some cases, it's too thin domestically, but what happened is that we became dependent upon a whole bunch of commercial sources that all got outsourced,
Hmm?
and Europe just went through that to a large extent with the Ukraine war. where the Russians actually propped up the environmental movement in Europe after Fukushima and made them it took countries like Germany that previously were 60 to 70% nuclear powered, and they elected radical green politicians that shut down all their reactors. And in the course of doing so, the only alternative was to become completely dependent upon Russian gas. And so, like, you see these decisions that were made somewhat from a position of safety that just had long standing consequences. And I think the lesson learned from we're now in the second quarter of the 21st century is that robustness, not just efficiency, matters, right?
Yeah,
And
of
you have to
course.
build systems that are anti-fragile. And the defense supply chain is so dependent upon commercial. We're slowly uncoupling it. On the drone front, we have things like what's called NDAA compliance, where we're trying to take Chinese components out of the supply chain. You have NDAA compliant drones, but like a lot of the stuff they build in Ukraine, it's still dependent upon
The
Russian or
ecosystem.
upon Chinese parts.
Yeah.
Like that they are not NDAA compliant at all in a lot of places. So if the Chinese said, okay, no parts for Ukraine, they'd be in deep trouble.
Yeah, and
Right?
that's really interesting. That's why I love doing these podcasts. That's actually from what I presumed is actually completely incorrect. And thank you very much for getting that overview and explaining it why. Moves us on to our next sector, then, which I think you've covered some points there, is industry outlook. So, with where the defence industry is now, what is up and coming in your viewpoint in the short and even potential long term, like where we go on a technology front, how is that going to adapt further? I know you've covered some of these points already, but try and give it an overview.
So there's a couple mega trends that are going on here. One is that, and to some extent, reversal of mega trends. So in 1992, Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, or 1993 actually, so under Clinton, held something he called the Last Supper. Okay, where he famously brought in all the defense contractors. At the time, there was probably 20 or 30 prime defense contractors in the U.S., and a lot of them were kind of sidecars to existing businesses. General Mills had a defense project; they make cereal. IBM had IBM Federal Systems; it was a defense prime contractor, right? You had all
Yeah.
these dual-use businesses. Ford Aerospace was part of Ford Motor Company, but had an aerospace component. So you had all these prime contractors are brought in and they were told to consolidate. So over time, for the next 15 years, during the 90s, the defense budget actually shrunk. It was called the Peace Net, right? And so these companies all shrank and consolidated. We went from like those 30 primes that were part of dual-use commercial businesses down to really maybe 5 plus 1 big primes, because Huntington Ingalls is the shipyards for like the carriers.
They all just bought and conformed together.
Yeah, so Raytheon, Northrop, Boeing, Lockheed, and General Dynamics, right? We're kind of the big five, right? And then there's a couple others parenthetically that are, like for example, SAIC, now Leidos, is one, in Sierra Nevada is another. Okay, so those became about 98% of what's called major defense acquisition program. The people on Capitol Hill have realized that that's a formula for disaster, along with cost plus contracting. They've had numerous, they've tried to mitigate it. We had like Nunn McCurdy in the 2000s that tried to do cost containment and scope containment and better management of these contracts. It didn't work. Everything just kept blowing up. And part of it was like the paradox of exquisiteness that there's a guy named Norm Augustine who had what was called Augustine's laws. And one of them was this idea that that airplanes over time keep getting more expensive and more exquisite, which means they're fewer in number. And the joke is that in the year 2060, there'll be, one aircraft in the entire DoD, and it'll be, the Air Force will get it 4 days a week, the Navy will get it 6.5 days a week, and then the Marine Corps gets visitation every other weekend.
It'll just be that good. They can do everything.
So that was kind of the power law that we were following with, like, you look at the price trend of the B-2 and the F-22 and stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're seeing a reversal of that. We're seeing, kind of a couple of initiatives they're having in simultaneity. One is that they're trying to encourage more prime defense contractors to both open up competition and make us less reliant and dependent on the few defense contractors there are. So what I've heard from policymakers and others is that they'd like to go from 5, maybe not necessarily to 100, because it's not a robust, that's too competitive of an ecosystem, and you may have like failures in contracts because companies go bankrupt or exit stuff, but certainly to like 15 or 20. Okay. We have a couple of those that are already entered. I would say like SpaceX at this point is a prime contractor, as is Palantir. So you have to recognize that. I think that General Atomics, Nevada, and Leidos have to be included in that because they have several billion in revenue, and I think CACI would like to be included in that as well. But that leaves room for 4, 5, 6, maybe 10 startups to each take a vertical. Maybe there's an opportunity for a nuclear one to get in there. And then I think in the RF domain, like, I would like CX2 to be one of those players as well, obviously completely self-serving. And then, Epirus also plays into that as well. Like,
Yeah, nice.
And then the other one that's worth mentioning is, especially now that they've merged with Blue Halo, is AeroVironment. So opening up from 5 prime contractors to 15 or 20 in the United States. And then at the tier 1 level, we have probably 20 tier 1 providers. What I mean by that is people that build components. That's companies like Honeywell, right, that build cards, Mercury Systems. These are publicly traded companies that mostly build components. They're not prime contract managers on the government side. So I think like those can probably expand from about 20 or so that exist today to probably 50 or maybe more, and be a little bit more proliferated with a lot more commercial exposure as well. Okay, so that's the other piece of it. And then I haven't even talked about Europe yet. So Europe, you're seeing this massive,
startup innovation.
We haven't seen, probably the largest since World War II. And you're seeing the emergence of a very healthy, robust drone ecosystem in Europe, and then also some emerging kind of primes or wannabe primes. You have your Helsings and Techiver's, another one on the drone side. I think they've broken Quantum Systems, etc. So I think like those are some other players that are worth mentioning.
There's a big influx definitely in Europe of these drone startups, definitely. Primarily in Munich. Munich and Germany seems to be going for the roof with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's amazing is you look at the valuation of companies like Rheinmetall that, I think their market cap is approaching $100 billion today, whereas like in 2021, the only defense contractor worldwide that had more than $100 billion in market cap, leaving out Boeing because there's a major commercial component, was Lockheed Martin. So, you're seeing this massive increase in valuation, and some of it's based on anticipation of future earnings, and it's the fact that you have like Germany making an $800 billion defense commitment over the next 5 years, and then all these European defense companies are countries that are stepping up and saying we're going to meet our NATO obligations because we aren't sure if the U.S. is a reliable partner. Is sort of like what they say.
Yeah, or they stretch too thin. We actually need to build our own defense systems to partner and help America.
Right, and the fact of the matter is that they haven't been a reliable partner either. I think at one point the Germans had 6 destroyers that were seaworthy.
I agree.
For a country of 80 million people. So it kind of cuts both ways, right?
I agree.
And like you saw the lesson learned from Ukraine, where they weren't really able to provide a
any form of defense
recently, right? And let's face it, Russia's a third world country with a gas station attached, right? And yet they're fighting off. They're holding their own against
Europe
in Ukraine, right?
From your viewpoint, obviously, with the huge explosion in the defense industry, with the innovation there and the exciting opportunity that's developing, from your standpoint, like if I'm a young engineer or an upcoming engineer or even a senior engineer in one of these other industries, why do you feel that they should be looking at defense, in your opinion, for the career move? Or why do you feel defense would be the place to be for commercial or technical roles?
Well, I would say it's probably the most interdisciplinary of the fields in terms of if you, in a single career, you want to touch space systems, underwater systems, robotics, cloud, cybersecurity, all these different domains within a defense company, you're going to touch all of them. So you're going to touch a lot of different things and you're going to learn a lot of different disciplines. I mean, that's not to say there's not opportunities for specialization. I mean, I have plenty of specialists here that work, have deep expertise in, RF receivers and transmitters and antenna design and things like that, autonomous flight. But I think that, if you're looking to solve lots of a diversity of problems across many domains and see how they fit together as systems, like aerospace and defense is very exciting in that respect, right? It's not like going to work for Airbnb where, you're going to be building software to go pitch, help people pitch their condo as a vacation rental, right? And that's not to diminish it. I mean, I use Airbnb all the time, but
fantastic app.
Much more mean, it's much more of a focused problem, right? I will say, like, one thing that we need that's a little different than like a lot of the big tech companies, they focus a lot on sort of full stack development. It's a lot of containerized software development and stuff. Ours, it's we do a lot of bare metal programming. We do a lot of C, C++ firmware, sometimes even lower than that. A lot of digital signal processing, and that's stuff that oftentimes the computer science programs at many of these universities have neglected or aren't emphasizing as much anymore. People aren't dealing with compilers and stuff. They just throw software in a Kubernetes or a container and just run it in the cloud, right? And so I think like those sorts of skills are invaluable and would make you in high demand in real-time systems, robotics, etc. And like we see some of the consequences of that too, right? Like one of the most annoying things for me is that every consumer device, including my car, they seem to have taken the Android operating system, which sucks, and have like copied it everywhere, right? So like my TV freezes because it's got Android, it doesn't have a real-time operating system with interventions. And so I'll be sitting there pressing the button going, why the heck won't it, turn off Netflix? It seems to be stuck. And it's because the Android operating system's hung up, right? My car does the same thing. My car, the infotainment system resets all the time. Sometimes it does it when I'm in backup mode, and that's not good, right? And it's because we've sort of lost that expertise in terms of real-time operating systems, containerized embedded software, et cetera. It's become a lot less common. So if I was to like pick one thing, I would say, that's an area that's like really high demand in aerospace and defense. And then of course, the generative AI revolution's coming into play there. But I think that it's going to be a while before generative AI catches up to what humans can do in terms of embedded software. Like I just don't
Yeah.
see them, I don't see, I mean, like AI can write you like helper code and things like that, like with copilots, but it's not going to do timing and sizing optimization on a channelizer that you need for DSP,
Of course, yeah,
right?
that's limited with bandwidth or limited with space, and that's why embedded is become always
Or
always
it's
been
going to have,
critical, but now it seems to be the most critical.
yeah, it's going to have goofy corner cases, and who knows, maybe the next generation, 5 years or 10 years from now. But today it doesn't seem to be the case, right? So I think like it's an area of problem solving, like designing new algorithms and things that can be very stimulating.
Hmm.
And I think it's very exciting. So that, and then being able to kind of marry that with some understanding of hardware and how that interacts in the real world is really cool. So like we've seen a revolution, a number of things in the last 15, 20 years that I put myself in the shoes of 23-year-old Nathan, and I think, my God, I wish I had this, right? Like
Yeah.
some of the dashboard tools we have, like Sift and Epsilon 3 and Nominal and all that today, that allow you to have observability into your manufacturing processes, into what data that's coming off the system, into how all the different artifacts that you're using to build things, from an engineering standpoint, are organized and nested and how they're progressing. Like it's nothing short of incredible. We used to do all that with giant Excel spreadsheets and macros that would like crash all the time, and now it's all being done through these automated SaaS tools, and it's pretty cool. And I think like that's freed up a ton of effort.
So you just have all these little tasks, these minute tasks now that would take time, that had to be done critically correct to allow us to innovate, that actually can be taken away. So the focus time. And what you said at the beginning of the podcast was fantastic. We're in an era now where actually whatever you can imagine with the technology is actually doable. And that's a line that's going to
Yeah.
stick with me.
So I think like the automation and software and now AGI is freeing up the drudgery, but the human creativity and human insight still has a lot of value. And so focusing on areas where humans are uniquely capable of that and building an understanding and interdisciplinary systems engineering, I think really differentiates the candidates that have that from the ones that don't. Rather than just, hey, I know how to turn this crank. I know what the crank attaches to and why, and how that fits into the greater universe. And then, having those skills, I think, is really useful. And the hunger and the curiosity. One thing I kind of look for with people is I search for candidates that have curiosity, where they
Yeah.
see something that's wrong and it bothers them, and they have like an autonomous urge to fix it.
Which is good, yeah. And as a space, as I said, it's the innovation, the opportunity there, the critical needs for these systems outside of that is great. But yeah, the innovation of the defence industries. And we're only at the very beginning of the journey, so it's going to be exciting to watch. But okay, so I would say, Litchak, thank you very much for your time. You've shared some fantastic ideas for out on here, and your journey has been amazing. Typically, we give the guests the opportunity to talk about a bit more spotlight on the business, a bit of an overview of around.
Yeah, so we're at the nexus of a couple different disciplines where we are. There's obviously a strong RF and electronic warfare focus, but like I mentioned, we make heavy use of embedded software. We're a heavy user of and seller of autonomous systems, right? So it's sort of the convergence of RF and electronic warfare, autonomous systems, um, and kind of embedded software and generative AI, right? So like
Yeah,
those where those three things meet, that's kind of where we fit together, and that's a hard skill set. So we're looking
yeah,
for people who, like you said, obviously a heavy emphasis on embedded software, infrastructure software. We are trying to hire for a front end role as well right now, but we also have back end roles, full stack. We have lots of full stack software people. Guidance, navigation, and control is another area, and autonomy, kind of how that fits in there. So people with skills in things like, SLAM processing and autopilots, things
hmm
like that. And then obviously the RF engineering, so antenna design, RF chain analysis and design, digital signal processing, feature extraction, that sort of things, application of neural networks to RF engineering, those sorts of skills. Those are kind of the people we're looking for. And then just generally, on the BD side, we tend to look for people who have expertise in the space and are hungry and work hard and think well on their feet in remote environments. Oftentimes when we're doing an exercise and something goes wrong, you're not in a position to call home and ask for help. You need to figure it out.
of course, yeah. When you're doing first time solutions as well, it's you've got to be a problem solver, haven't you, mentally?
Yeah. So, but those are kind of the big things we're looking for right now. We need a lot more DSP and embedded software engineering. Those people are always in short supply around here, and then RF expertise, and then guidance, navigation, and control are kind of three areas that come to mind.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Nathan. I know how critical you're on time. I'm telling you, just thank you so much for getting behind the incentive and sharing your journey. It's been fantastic to have you on.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. Thanks for having me on, Luke.
Perfect.